Before we begin, a heads up. This audio documentary shares personal stories and perspectives about alleged spiritual and sexual abuse. Some content is mature and may be graphic. Listener discretion is advised. If you feel overwhelmed while listening, please pause and seek support from a trusted friend or professional. Parents and guardians, please preview before sharing with minors.
The sisters never really told me which sister had said that she was assaulted. In reality, they never told me that she said she was assaulted. They didn't really tell me any details at all. But they also told me not to try to figure it out. But it was kind of obvious just looking around the community. So even though I knew that it was probably her, I just stayed far away from her. But I observed her from afar. I didn't even know exactly what Father Dave had done, but I could see the impact of it, and I felt angry. The thing is, I didn't feel angry on my own behalf. That took a lot more time. And I think the reason that I didn't want to feel angry on my own behalf, and I kind of had to unearth that feeling, was because I had to come to terms that I was also a victim of Father Dave. I was thinking of myself as just the corroborator of the other sister. I was going to give my testimony. I was going to help people to see that what happened to her wasn't a coincidence. But for a long time, I just didn't realize how much his grooming had impacted me. And my superiors were supportive of me. I think they really appreciated that I was willing to share my testimony, but they didn't understand that I had been traumatized too. It wasn't until at a certain point it just was getting hard for me to get through the day.
Hi everyone, this is Sister Danielle Victoria. A few years ago, Sister Theresa Aletheia and I did something brave, or something reckless depending on who's listening. We both left the convent and began the long process of beginning a new religious community of nuns, or more technically accurate, religious sisters. We each had entered the convent more than a decade ago, but we felt God calling us to something else, to a new mission to people on the fringes of the church, especially those wounded, abused, or scandalized by members of the church. But for us, this mission wasn't abstract. It was personal. Just after we started our new community, Sister Theresa and I decided that before we began this mission, we needed to tell our own stories of abuse to protect anyone who could be harmed. In 2024, we came forward publicly to share our experiences of spiritual abuse at the hands of a trusted priest. This audio documentary delves more into our stories and the nuances and complexity of adult abuse in spiritual settings.
This podcast isn't about breaking our silence.
We've already shared our story publicly. It's about breaking open how spiritual abuse happens, why it so often goes unnoticed or unaddressed, and how we can begin to build communities that are more honest, more human, and more hopeful. Each of us has a role to play in this work of repair. We invite you to join us in this difficult but essential work. This audio documentary is the first major step in the mission of the Sisters of the Little Way of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness. A mission of listening in solidarity with people on the fringes of the church, especially those who have been wounded, abused, or scandalized by members of the church. If you would like to support our mission and projects like this, please visit sistersofthelittleway.com. In this episode, we delve into the psychological toll on Sister Theresa Aletheia after learning that Father Dave had allegedly sexually assaulted another religious sister. What followed was a storm of fear, confusion, and anger as she began to confront the painful truth that she too had been a victim. Welcome to Descent into Light.
For a long time, I really had no idea what Father Dave had done exactly with this other sister, but I did know that he had tried to enter into a sexual relationship with her, and that was enough for me to see everything he'd done in a different light. Every moment that made me uncomfortable, every strange spiritual invitation, it just snapped into place. This wasn't a man who had just fallen in love with one sister and slipped up. I knew that. This was someone who knew how to use his spiritual authority, how to weaponize it, and to groom and manipulate women who placed their trust in him. Women like me, women like this other sister. And I had a feeling that there were more people who had experienced this. It was a pattern. It was a strategy. Even then, I didn't know the full truth of what had happened until I read the details in the pillar when we shared our stories, and the sister shared hers anonymously.
The sister who said she was assaulted by Father Dave chose not to participate in this project, and we fully respect her decision. For the purposes of this series, we'll call her Sister Judith, but she did share her story with the pillar. Here are some of the details she shared about the incident. Over time, she said that Father Dave, quote, led her prayer into the sexual realm. He said he knew better and that some things only advanced people know and experience in prayer. The implication of it all was I would be unfaithful to Jesus' desires if I did not follow the spiritual director's lead. This was all extremely gradual and subtle, end quote. Then one day, Father Dave asked her to join him on an outing. First, he brought her to a hospital where he said Mass. She said, quote, during Mass at the hospital, Father gave this homily that likened Jane Frances de Chantal and Francis de Sales to Francis and Claire, because Claire's feast was just the day before that, and he said that they had a sexual relationship, end quote. From there, Father Dave brought Sister Judith out for a picnic. He had packed lunches and brought blankets upon which to sit. But during that picnic lunch, she said, he began making sexual advances towards her. Those sexual advances, Sister Judith alleged, became assault as he began groping her without her consent and placed his hands on her private areas. She said she, quote, kept moving away from him and I was telling him to stop, but I felt paralyzed, end quote. Despite that, she said the priest continued to touch her body. She said, quote, he was whispering from the Song of Songs in my ear, and I was like, I can't believe he is doing this. I actually couldn't believe it. But at that point, I felt paralyzed because I trusted him more than I trusted myself. That was part of the equation he set up. So of course I was thinking, he's the leader. He's the leader. He's been the sole leader. End quote. When spiritual abuse occurs, it doesn't just violate boundaries or break trust. It can fracture the very foundation of a person's identity. It can shake the ground you thought you were standing on, the ground of your vocation, your faith, your belonging. Suddenly, the places that once felt safest, your church, your community, even your own body, begin to feel foreign, uncertain, and dangerous. And that's what happened to Sister Judith, Sister Theresa Aletheia, and me. In this episode, Sister Theresa Aletheia recounts the psychological and spiritual aftermath of her trauma, the hypervigilance, the trouble sleeping, the confusion, the anger, the feeling of being unsafe in spaces that once had been sacred. She takes us through the mental and physical toll that comes from realizing that someone you trusted to guide you was in reality manipulating you. That someone who represented the church, who helped you to discern the will of God in your life, was using that power to groom and harm others. As we continue to journey through the stages of grief after abuse, we arrive at one of the most misunderstood and stigmatized emotions, anger. For many survivors of spiritual abuse, anger feels both urgent and dangerous. Sometimes, cultural norms in Christian communities teach us to fear our anger, to suppress it, to see it as incompatible with holiness. But what if anger is not the enemy? What if anger is actually a sign of love, of clarity, of courage. Join us as we work our way through the stages of grief in the aftermath of abuse. In this episode, we explore the third stage, the anger that Sister Theresa Aletheia experienced as she grappled with the traumatic fallout of being groomed by a trusted priest and spiritual advisor. This is not just a story of trauma, it's a story of finding one's voice, of stepping into the sacred, necessary space where healing begins, not despite anger, but through it. This is Descent into Light. Welcome to Episode 3, The Courage to be Angry.
Anger is a very important stage to the healing process because we have to be willing to feel our emotions. What I always like to tell people is the only way to is through. The only way to healing is you have to wade into those negative emotions in order to get through the other side of healing. Sometimes the more we're willing to feel that and be honest and not ashamed of the anger and the frustration, because anger is really a response to injustice, the injustice that you've experienced. And so we need a place for that voice, that part of you to be heard and to speak to that injustice. And so if we suppress it, it's only going to come out in less healthy ways. So you want to make sure that anger is channeled in a healthy way, but very important to experience.
I had so many red flags the whole time, but I think whenever I had a concern, I would just trust the judgment of other people over my own. But after I had realized what had been happening, I felt like I had been in the presence of an unsafe person, and that made me feel deeply unsafe with myself. Like I couldn't make decisions that would keep me safe. And knowing that I had an intuition that I was unsafe and I ignored it, that was really scary to me. I just lost a lot of trust in myself. I thought, like, how could you have trusted this person? I felt like I put myself in an unsafe situation, and I blamed myself. But for months after I realized that, I just felt scared all the time. I felt like I was running. I felt a constant, consistent feeling of fear. My blood felt like it was rushing. My anxiety level was really high. I would go to chapel, and that was a place that would always bring me peace and calm. And even there, and especially there, I would feel anxious, even more anxious. And that I would leave chapel just feeling so distressed because that had been my refuge. And now even the safest place in the world for me was unsafe.
So there's a category that some people talk about called betrayal trauma. And I feel like when we have a trauma committed by a spiritual leader, I think that can definitely fall into that category. Usually it involves trauma by a trusted person, but somebody who we trust to provide us either food, shelter, and clothing, like a parent, spiritual needs, like a spiritual leader could, a spiritual director, a priest, someone like that, or dependent on that person in some way, maybe a boss in our jobs, anything like that. And so when you're using religious beliefs to control, to manipulate, to cause harm, it can create a sense of guilt and shame, especially when it comes to spirituality, because our beliefs are integral to everything we do. It's our life. It's how we orient all of our decision making, our discernment, how we want to live, who we want to become, who we want to emulate, how we want to show ourselves in the world. And so when we're groomed by a spiritual leader, all of a sudden, it's, if I'm thinking about spiritual direction, if all of a sudden I'm having these profound spiritual encounters in prayer or revelations in conversation with my spiritual director, And coming to find out that some of those conversations might not have had anything to do with spirituality at all. They were just housed in the language of spirituality, but really with, again, that malintent to manipulate and control. Now I have to reevaluate my whole spiritual journey under the guidance of that person and figure out what's worth keeping and what's worth leaving behind. And that can be incredibly confusing.
I was just in a really dark place. I felt confused. I felt so many strong feelings. But since I hadn't come to terms with the fact that I was a victim of Father Dave, it felt like I was overreacting, like I was being dramatic. I was really actually ashamed of how strongly I was feeling about what had happened. But at the same time, like, I was having trouble coping. I had no one to talk to about what I was experiencing. There was one or two sisters that I was allowed to talk to about it. But aside from that, I just felt really alone. And when I did talk to the sisters about what I was experiencing, I felt like they tried to empathize, but they really couldn't understand what was going on for me. I think they didn't understand that I had been traumatized by what had happened. At one point, I was struggling so much that the sister who was helping me recommended that I go see a therapist. And that's really when everything changed. When I met with her, she immediately validated my experience. She helped me to understand my experience. And I started to let go of my self-blame. During one session, I was describing something to her about what Father Dave had done and how he had behaved. And I could see a flash of anger in her eyes. And I can't even describe how helpful that was because it helped me to access my own anger. And after several sessions, she said to me, "You have PTSD from what happened." It was really validating when she told me that. It explained so much about what I had been experiencing. But at the same time, I felt so angry. I had not wanted to be a victim of Father Dave. I did not want to experience anything that came along with experiencing the aftermath of trauma.
Because we are body and soul, our bodies often speak the truth long before our minds are ready to hear it. When spiritual abuse happens, it doesn't just break trust in a leader. It fractures your trust in God, in the church, in yourself. When the person who harmed you represents your faith, your beliefs, even your sense of God's goodness, the damage cuts through every layer of your identity. For both Sister Theresa and me, the betrayal was total. It seeped into every corner of our lives, it reawakened old wounds and called our deepest convictions into question. What happened left us struggling to make sense of everything, not just emotionally or physically, but spiritually. This kind of wound has a name, moral injury. A psychological term, moral injury describes the spiritual and emotional responses that sometimes occur following events that violate a person's moral or ethical code. Moral injury can result after betrayal trauma and events that threaten deeply held beliefs and trust. To understand moral injury more deeply and how it relates to abuse in the church, we spoke with Dr. Marcus Mescher, a moral theologian from Xavier University who co-led the first study to measure the moral injury caused by clergy abuse and its cover-up.
My name is Marcus Mescher. I'm an associate professor of Christian ethics at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. I got my PhD from Boston College in Catholic social teaching and moral formation, and I'm a lifelong Catholic. So moral injury arises from the experience of veterans returning from war and reflecting on their experience of combat. And it really comes from the writings of veterans themselves who are trying to put words or who are trying to find the language to describe persistent psychological distress, spiritual torment, moral confusion, social isolation, and distrust for institutions. There's no single definition of moral injury. At its core, moral injury is the result of a betrayal of sacred trust. Moral injury has helped me to understand, I think, maybe a more comprehensive picture of what this has been like and the way that it has shattered worldviews for the survivors and their loved ones, for people who work for the church or who represent the church, for lay Catholics, and for former Catholics, people who feel like the church has abandoned them and they can no longer feel a part of the church because of this betrayal. Even though we're using the term injury, it's not like, you fell and you hurt your ankle. I mean, this is something that really does a lot of damage, I think, in a comprehensive way, which is why I think it's worth highlighting moral injury as persistent psychological distress, profound spiritual torment, lasting moral confusion, social isolation, and distrust for institutions. Because moral injury results in psychological, spiritual, and moral disintegration. And it's often experienced as disorientation, alienation, and emptiness. The survivors of clergy sexual abuse that I have interviewed describe their experience like the rape or murder of their soul. And some survivors, talk about that alienation or the loneliness by saying, we talk about the church as a body of Christ, but it feels like the church just wants to amputate me and be done with me. So what I really want to highlight is that, insofar as humans are social creatures, moral injury is never simply intrapersonal. It always extends interpersonally and across institutions.
As Dr. Mesher explained, moral injury can result from a betrayal of trust. And when that betrayal comes from someone who holds spiritual authority, it can shake the very ground a person stands on. It doesn't just cause psychological pain, it fractures your moral compass. It can upend your sense of God. When Sister Judith shared her story with the Pillar, what she described was a textbook example of moral injury. She said, quote, "The only word for it all is this: shattering. My worldview shattered. My understanding of myself shattered. My understanding of the church shattered. And for about 2 years, I couldn't even read the Bible. All I had was my rosary." End quote. That word shattered is commonly used by survivors of clergy abuse because this kind of trauma doesn't just wound the mind or body, it reaches the soul. It disrupts everything, including a person's most sacred relationship, their relationship with God.
So the following year, after I found out what had happened with Father Dave, I was set to go on my annual summer retreat. And I was really feeling scared that I wouldn't be able to get through the retreat. And so I shared that with the sister who was working with me. And she said, "You'll be fine. Just try it. You'll be fine." And I wanted to believe that was true. So I just went and I asked that, could I at least have my direction sessions in another room different than the room where Father Dave had directed me? And the sister seemed frustrated that I asked that, but I didn't really care. I knew I needed at least that. And when I got to the retreat house, my annual retreat, like 8 days of silence, that is like one of the most important times of year for me every single year. It's precious, and I always feel really excited to begin. And this time, I felt scared. The minute I entered the retreat house, I felt scared. And when I passed by the room where he had directed me, my heart would race. I had a new spiritual director for this retreat, and it was someone who I didn't know, who wasn't trained in spiritual direction. And the first time I met with him, I thought I should explain a little bit why I'm feeling nervous, just so he has some context. And the moment I explained it to him, his eyes got really big and he looked absolutely terrified to be in the same room with me. And he said, I'm sorry that happened to you. At least he said that. But after that, I could just tell he felt really uncomfortable to be around me. And I felt like something was wrong with me. A few days into the retreat, I just realized I couldn't keep going to the spiritual director because he was so uncomfortable around me. He acted like I had some kind of contagious disease every time I entered into the room. And that made my feelings of discomfort and fear even worse. I remember after one session, I went back to my room and had a panic attack. And at that point, I just called my therapist and I told her what was happening. And she said, "Get out of there. You need to go there when you feel like it's a safe space to go to, but you're being very triggered right now and you need to leave." And so as I was preparing to leave, I just felt so angry. Like Father Dave had taken so much from me already, and now he was taking away my annual retreat. That was such an important time for me. And as I was driving home, a sister was driving me home. And I don't even know if she knew why I was going home. I never knew really who knew. And as I was sitting next to her in the car, I felt like a complete failure, like I was a disappointment to the sisters and I was no longer useful because of how I had been impacted. I felt like a burden.
The thing about this part of Sister Theresa Aletheia's story that hits me every time I hear it is this. She's not just describing her own trauma, she's describing the response to it, the way our community of sisters tried to support her. The intentions were good, even beautiful at times, but even with the best of intentions, there was this overwhelming inability to grasp the sheer depth of the trauma she had experienced. And that rings painfully true in my own experience. When I began to show symptoms of trauma, panic attacks, emotional numbness, exhaustion, it wasn't always met with understanding. Not because people didn't care, but because they didn't know how to see it. They didn't have a framework for what trauma looks like in someone who is still showing up to prayer, who is still putting on the habit every morning, who is still doing everything right. As beautifully as some of our sisters responded, as deeply as many of them wanted to help, there were also moments, and not just a few, where the responses fell short, sometimes tragically short. And instead of easing our wounds, they deepened them. It's hard to say that out loud. Harder still when it's about people you love. But if we want to understand how abuse like this happens and how it continues, we have to look beyond the person who abused. We have to examine the environment that allowed it, the culture that didn't know how to respond, the silence that said, "This is too uncomfortable to face." If we can't look at the soil that the wound took root in, we'll never be able to truly heal it. Our mission as Sisters of the Little Way is a call to the Church to address the roots of abuse, to listen and to stand in solidarity with those on the fringes of the Church, especially those who have been wounded, abused, or scandalized by her own members. But this mission doesn't belong to us alone. It belongs to anyone who refuses to look away. Join us at sistersofthelittleway.com.
I'm really grateful for that. I think the Lord gave me as a conviction that I had done nothing wrong in my relationship with Father Dave. There was nothing consensual or remotely sexual about what was going on for me in relating to him. Of course, that doesn't mean that I couldn't have been manipulated in that direction. But if I had been in the future, that would have been manipulation. That would have been abuse. It would not have been consensual. That was really something that was clear to me, and I'm really grateful for that. Because I remember one time telling a sister about what had happened, and she said to me, "Do you think that it would help you to go to confession?" And I looked at her, I was just completely stunned. And I said, "No, I don't need to go to confession. I didn't do anything wrong." In that moment, I think I got a glimpse of how people might perceive me in this situation if I were to talk about what had happened. I just felt like if someone I had trusted thought that I might need absolution for what had happened, then other sisters and other people would think along the same lines. Even though I knew that I would probably talk about what had happened to me publicly at some point, I just had an intuition that I would do that. But it was difficult to see how I might be seen if I did. Another time that became clear to me, I was sitting in the cafeteria and the leader of the US and Canada stood up, and she had told me she was going to be making an announcement about Father Dave. He had been in a compromising situation with a sister and that he was no longer allowed on our property or around our sisters. And I remember looking forward to the announcement. I was glad that we were going to finally speak about this in the open. But the moment that she said it, I felt relief and validation, and the tide just turned really quickly. People started to murmur and talk, and some sisters questioned. It was as if the suspicion immediately fell on the sister involved. And the sisters didn't even know who the sister was or if she was even in the room. But they just immediately started to defend Father Dave and feel bad for Father Dave. That really opened my eyes, because I saw that just as I had given Father Dave the benefit of the doubt every single time there was something that he did that bothered me, people would do the same thing. I knew that would be the cost of speaking up. That people might think of me as broken or complicit or shameful. I think every survivor who thinks about coming forward with their story knows that's going to be the cost.
Sister Judith recounted the same incident in the cafeteria in the interview she gave The Pillar. Here's what Sister Judith said, quote, "The provincial superior got on the microphone and said there were credible allegations against Father Dave, and that Mother General had been informed. From that point on, no sister was to have contact with him. If he stepped foot on any of our properties, we were to notify the local superior immediately," end quote. There were about 50 sisters in the room. Sister Judith had purposely sat near the door, ready to slip out quietly, and then she heard it. One sister at her table leaned toward another and said, quote, "Father Dave is such a good man. It's so unfortunate how persecuted priests are these days," end quote. That reaction wasn't rare. As Sister Judith said, quote, "That was in the air," end quote. Now let's be clear. We're not talking about cold-hearted people here. These are women who have given up everything to follow the gospel, to live lives radically shaped by love. And yet, in a moment that demanded compassion and courage, many responded by suspecting the sister who had been hurt rather than Father Dave. The question is why? The term victim blaming is thrown around a lot, but it often isn't really understood. We're going to talk more with an expert about what this term actually means in a minute. But suffice it to say, victim blaming grows in environments where protecting the institution, our identity, our image, becomes more important than protecting the person in pain. And when that fear takes root, it clouds our vision. We stop seeing clearly, we forget how to love well, we forget our own humanity. To understand more about clericalism and victim blaming, we spoke with Lucy He. She's a doctoral research fellow at Baylor University who is currently conducting a study to better understand the impact of adult clergy sexual abuse.
Clericalism can directly contribute to this dynamic of victim blaming because clericalism is basically the system within religious institutions where clergy are elevated above the lay people and they're seen as being higher than the people that they're supposed to be serving. Victim blaming is this tendency to not want to face the truth, basically, because it just takes too much to dismantle what you've believed, not just about that person, but the entire Catholic Church. And people would rather not go down that path. So it just becomes cognitively easier to blame it on the victim rather than to think that there's a chance that this holy person is actually a predator. Victim blaming is really common when an institution wants to protect itself and this will lead to institutional betrayal. And institutional betrayal is, to put it very simply, when an organization that's supposed to care about you and protect you and put your best interest first, they instead prioritize their own interests. And often that happens because of money and reputation and just wanting to preserve their image. On the other hand, institutional courage is the opposite. It involves immediately removing the abusers, listening to survivors, believing them when they choose to come forward, and providing support to them. And not just that, but it means implementing real reforms.
Just like Sister Judith and Sister Theresa, I learned early on that speaking up about Father Dave came with a cost. If I ever told the truth, I might not be believed. Worse, I might be blamed. I'll never forget one particular moment when I was on a long car ride with another sister. It felt like a rare chance for honesty, for real conversation. So I took a breath, summoned my courage, and began. I told her that Father Dave once played a significant role in my life. I hadn't even gotten to what had happened, just a hint, a beginning. She didn't even let me finish. She interrupted and said, "Well, you know how younger sisters can be with priests." I froze. In that one offhand sentence, everything inside me recoiled. I wasn't just dismissed, I was implicated. She wasn't questioning Father Dave, she was questioning me and sisters like me. Her words didn't name it outright, but the meaning was clear. Some sisters let that sort of thing happen. Maybe she even wanted it. I went silent. I didn't say another word for the rest of the drive, and something shifted in me. In that moment, I realized that if I spoke up, I risked being seen as one of those sisters, naive and maybe even seductive. I had just professed vows. I was new, vulnerable. I had given my life to this community. The idea of being seen that way, of being cast out or quietly discredited, was terrifying. Looking back now, I can see that that's the moment fear took root in me. It buried itself deep, and for years it kept me from even admitting to myself how much harm had been done. This is how clericalism works. This is how victim blaming takes hold. Because when someone holding a position of power causes harm, blaming the person with less power is often the path of least resistance. And the more authority someone holds, the more respected, charismatic, or holy they appear, the more likely others within the institution or community are to protect them and to make excuses. We also look the other way because it's easier than confronting our own fear, shame, and doubt. If we have invested our personal identity and security in an institution, any threat to the institution can be felt as a threat to ourselves, and better to erase that threat than to face it. Perpetrators know this. They count on it. That's why they often target those least likely to be believed. Someone younger, someone without status, someone whose voice is easier to dismiss. And the rest of us, we fall in line. As the cost of questioning that power, of standing with the one who speaks the uncomfortable truth, is often more than we think we can bear.
I think one of the reasons it took me a really long time to realize that what Father Dave was doing was inappropriate was because he did it right out in the open. He didn't sneak around. He didn't act like he had something to hide. He always acted like everything he did was perfectly normal. I remember one moment in particular, we had just finished our annual retreat, and Father Dave had been my spiritual director. And I was standing around in a group of sisters. He walked up to me, and Father Dave smiled like nothing was out of the ordinary, and then pressed himself into me like a full body hug. And he hugged me really tightly, front to front, and held me there. And it felt like forever. It felt like people in the room were starting to get uncomfortable, and I was just frozen. I couldn't move. I remember I felt like completely tense all over my body, and shame just like crept up, and my face got so red. And then he finally pulled away from me, and he caressed my cheek like a boyfriend would, and he said, "I'll see you later." And my face was so red, I was just embarrassed. I felt like that was really weird, right? I And I looked around trying to find someone who would help me understand what had just happened. And I caught the eye of a sister, and she looked at me and she rolled her eyes and she looked really disgusted. And at first I thought she was disgusted by what he had done. And then I realized I think she was disgusted with me. And that moment, I think I realized how easy it is for people to misread situations like that. If that sister who knew me and prayed with me and saw me every day, if she could think that, then how is anyone else going to understand? It took me a long time to unravel that and to not feel ashamed, like I had done something to deserve that, and to realize what it was. It was a violation out in the open. And what made it even more painful was the way that other people responded, or really didn't respond.
Jennifer Freyd, who is a scholar at Harvard, studies betrayal trauma. And she actually explains that people who are close to the abuse, people who, could have or maybe should have done something to intervene, that they don't know how to piece that reality together with their self-image or their understanding of themselves. And so they avoid that implication. And it's too raw, it's too painful, it's too personal. And so they deny their implication as someone who's near to it or could have done something. I think that's been really hard to hear from so many survivors who know that there was a school secretary or a parish secretary or another priest or a seminarian or another sister, someone who knew what was happening and stayed silent. And so I think that, those examples show how moral injury can be experienced by different people based on their proximity to the abuse. There's a woman I know who was abused as a young girl, and when she told the bishop about her abuse many years later, the first words he said were, "Well, you must have been really developed for a 6-year-old girl to catch the eye of a priest." And in so many cases, not just clergy, but other lay Catholics, they can say, "Oh, that must have been a misunderstanding," or "It must have been the way you were dressed or what you said or how you acted." I mean, we've normalized a lot of victim blaming in our social context. I think all of us experience some degree of moral injury by being exposed to a toxic environment that normalizes blaming the victim or that minimizes the gravity of these wounds.
This is an important moment, so pay attention. What Dr. Mesher is pointing to is the reality that often our go-to response is either victim blaming or scapegoating the perpetrator of abuse, or a combo of these two things. But that doesn't get to the root of the problem. We will explore this concept for the rest of our series because it's one of the most important things to understand about abuse, so don't worry if it doesn't make complete sense just yet. But suffice it to say, this series is not about Father Dave. In fact, what happened with Father Dave wasn't just about Father Dave. All of this was bigger than him. It was about a culture, a whole system within his community and within our community, and within the church as a whole. Creating safety requires recognizing that abuse is not just about the people who perpetrate and cover up abuse, but about the underlying culture that needs to be addressed so we can prevent abuse from continuing to happen. That's a hard truth to sit with. It's easier to bypass the full reality of abuse by focusing on the so-called bad apples. To say, well, abuse happens everywhere in families and schools, not just the church. And then, just like that, we wash our hands of it. It feels cleaner, easier, but it doesn't engage in the hard work of really preventing abuse. It's important to make clear that while we are going to explore some of the issues in our community that facilitated the abuse we experienced, we are not pointing the finger at our community. Though it's true that many of our sisters were not willing or not able to truly examine what had happened, many of them did show courage, even in the midst of an environment that encouraged silence. They spoke. They supported us. They loved us. they confronted Father Dave and his religious community directly. At the same time, they didn't call the police. When the sister who was allegedly assaulted came forward, when she named what had happened, that should have been the very next step, but it wasn't. So it became a kind of back and forth, some brave steps forward, others not taken far enough. And honestly, that's what most communities look like when abuse is exposed. Some things done right, others avoided, delayed, or ignored. The difference, the real difference, is whether a community is willing not just to face the person who is abused, but to face itself, to look at the conditions that allowed abuse to happen, and then to look at the ways it failed to respond when the truth came out. That's the deep work that abuse prevention requires.
Looking back, I really am grateful to our sisters because they defended me, especially the sister who was allegedly assaulted. They saw how she was harmed, and they asked Father Dave's community to support us in receiving therapy for what had happened. Father Dave's community really didn't seem... They immediately lawyered up. They asked us to share our testimonies before they would pay for our therapy, even though at that point, according to my understanding, Father Dave had already admitted to some degree what had happened to physical sexual contact with his sister. So despite that, they didn't agree to pay for therapy, and they said, maybe we will, but we need to see the testimonies of the sisters first. So the sisters asked me, would you be willing to share your testimony with Father Dave's community's lawyers? And I remember thinking, I really don't want to do that. I don't trust that would be a good situation. And it felt like another violation to share something so personal with this impersonal team of lawyers who I knew just had protecting Father Dave and his community in their interest. But the sisters really tried to convince me to do it, and so eventually I agreed, and I gave them permission to read my testimonies. I felt so vulnerable. And then after all of that, after sharing something that was so personal and vulnerable, Father Dave's community refused to pay for therapy for both me and the sister who said that he assaulted her. So I was angry with myself. That was another time where I think I ignored my intuition of what I should do in that situation. And I just felt really betrayed and angry. So at this point, the sisters were talking about how they were going to submit a case to the Vatican. And I knew I had given my testimony, and the other sister had given her testimony to Father Dave's lawyers, to his community's lawyers. He was the head of their community. Even though I was assured when I gave over my testimony that Father Dave wouldn't have access to it, he's the head of their community. I just felt so angry and helpless.
In January 2018, 5 months after the alleged sexual assault of the sister at the center of the situation, our religious community submitted a canonical case to the Vatican. This case included testimonies from Sister Theresa Aletheia and Sister Judith. Let's take a moment to explain what that means. The Catholic Church has its own legal system and norms, known as canon law, which has governed church matters for centuries. In fact, it's the oldest continuously functioning legal system in the Western world and has influenced many modern legal systems. Canon law covers everything from the sale of church property to the conduct of its members, especially clergy. Different departments within the Vatican, called dicasteries, handle various types of canonical cases. By submitting this case, our community was seeking justice through the Church's own legal channels. We appealed to the appropriate Vatican dicastery, asking them to investigate Father Dave's behavior and impose a penalty. Sister Theresa Aletheia and Sister Judith provided official testimonies. Although others in our community, including myself, had similar experiences with Father Dave, only these two sisters participated in the case directly. What we didn't expect was how long it would take. For 2 years, Sister Theresa Aletheia and Sister Judith waited, hoping for justice.
So our sisters submitted the canonical case to the Vatican. One bright spot of the whole situation was how Cardinal O'Malley responded. When the sisters sent him the case, he immediately looked it over and immediately told the sisters he was forwarding it onto the Vatican. He also suspended Father Dave's faculties, so Father Dave couldn't say Mass or hear confession in his archdiocese. It felt like among all of these people who had not taken seriously what had happened, finally someone was taking it seriously. And that gave me hope that the Vatican would take it seriously too and respond well. So I can't even describe what it's like waiting for a decision like that, to think my name is known in some obscure office in the Vatican. Some official knows who I am because I am accusing a priest of grooming me. It was like, just to think of that was really surreal and disorienting. At the time, I really didn't understand canon law. I didn't know what the Vatican might do in response to our case, or even what it could do. No one had even showed me the other sister's testimony. No one told me what it exactly had happened to her, so I didn't know what the response would be, but I knew pretty much what would have been in her testimony. Because it had happened to me. It was the same spiritual language, subtle erosion of boundaries, just the same grooming playbook. And I believed, because I could see it, that the experts in the Vatican would be able to recognize it for what it was, that they would see what I saw. But deep down, I also knew how confused even my own community had been. And I had seen the subtle blame, even in that use of the phrase, a compromising situation, as if the sister should not have put herself in that situation. It just seemed like the sisters didn't understand that by the time these things happen, someone has control over the other person. I understood that because I knew that was what Father Dave was probably working towards with me. The thing is that Father Dave had manipulated someone who is under his spiritual care. I mean, it's like a therapist who would do that with a patient, and therapists and counselors lose their licenses for doing that. So why wouldn't a priest? All that time, my greatest hope was that this was going to be dealt with firmly and justly. People were going to be protected, and I could just move on. Because the thing is, I didn't want to publicly speak about my story. I did not want to be the one that would have to share what I had experienced. I was just hoping that someone else would take responsibility to stop him. But we waited a really long time for a decision, and the longer we waited, the more I was just asking myself, is Father Dave still doing this with someone else or multiple people? Wondering that was the worst part of waiting.
Sister Theresa Aletheia and Sister Judith would wait 2 long years for a decision from the Vatican. Finally, in a letter dated January 20, 2020, the sisters received the Vatican's decision. It said that the sisters' testimonies were, quote, clear, essential, and schematic in the exposition of the facts, and those narrated facts are characterized by significant likelihood, end quote. At the same time, it concluded that Father Dave had made a, quote, respectable defense characterized by a credibility similar to that which characterizes your reports, end quote. It continued, quote, although there is no reason to doubt the sincerity of what you have stated, at the same time it must be considered that there is a total lack of witnesses and/or circumstances which, even indirectly, confirm or contribute to confirm your statements, and thereby do not attribute objective certainty to your accusations." End quote. It concluded, quote, "Therefore, in consideration only of your statements, you will well understand why it is not possible to reach a certain reconstruction of what happened, nor to a clear or equally certain definition of the eventual responsibilities of Father Nagorski." End quote. In other words, the decision was that no decision could be made. It was a he said, she said situation. Or really more accurately, it was a he said, she said situation.
I was really shocked when the decision came back. I didn't expect a perfect response, but I expected something to be done. And when I realized nothing was going to be done, I didn't know what to do with that. When I read the letter, the line that is still seared in my memory was that there's a total lack of witnesses and/or circumstances which even indirectly confirm or contribute to confirm your statements. A total lack of witnesses. I remember staring at those words and thinking, I was a witness. My testimony detailed the grooming, the manipulation, the spiritual coercion. Why didn't they see me? Why didn't they believe me? Was it something that I said or how I shared it? It made me question everything because they didn't believe me. Did I imagine it? Was I too damaged to be believed? Why hadn't they believed me?
Sister Theresa Aletheia and Sister Judith received the Vatican's first official response in January of 2020, nearly 2 years after submitting their testimonies. The timing was uncanny. Just months later, the COVID-19 pandemic would sweep across the globe, ushering in a time of isolation, uncertainty, and fear, a world unraveling both inside and out. At the time, I had no idea the case had been decided. I wasn't told what the Vatican had said. I didn't know what evidence had been submitted or what consequences, if any, Father Dave might face. I assumed, perhaps foolishly, that the right decision would be made and the whole matter would unfold quietly, far from me, behind closed doors. I was relieved not to be involved. But then something happened, and suddenly, I couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. This audio documentary is the first step in the mission of the Sisters of the Little Way of Beauty, Truth, and Goodness, a mission of listening and solidarity with people on the fringes of the Church, especially those who have been wounded, abused, or scandalized by members of the Church. If you would like to support our mission and projects like this, please visit sistersofthelittleWay.com.
There is cancer in my bones from the poison I've accepted. There is blood on my hands from the work they have neglected. And this hole beside my heart, this is love rejected. These weakened muscles, this is my body.